Okay, and I believe everyone is being admitted, so I'm just going to do a quick introduction. Once again, my name is Jessica Sundstrom, and hello and welcome to the Kalamazoo Institute of Art's ArtBreak at Home series. This is our second ever version of the new ArtBreak, and we are thrilled you have chosen to join us this afternoon. But before I introduce our speaker, a little bit of housekeeping. So we are reintroducing our educational programs online, which of course includes the ArtBreak you're in right now. And upcoming this month, September 12th, 10:30 a.m. is the Art Detectives Online. There are free supply packets. So if you would like to join us, it's for children 4 to 8 years old. There's a story, art looking, and art making. You can email me at jessicas@kiarts.org, and I believe it will also be online on our webpage under the free ticketing system. September 16th at 2 p.m., the book discussion is The Portrait of Dr. Gachet, The Story of a Van Gogh Masterpiece, Money, Politics, Collectors, Greed, and Loss by Cynthia Saltzman, with discussion leader Patrick Norris. For more information, please email library@kiarts.org. Unreeled is September 17th at 7 p.m. It is a new documentary by filmmaker Andrew Francisco. Some of you may have seen the film he did with us around this time last year. It will premiere on Vimeo with a password, and you can chat with the filmmaker, actor, and MC, and make suggestions to possibly name the film. And so now our speaker, Chicago-based multidisciplinary artist William J. O'Brien, juror for the 2020 West Michigan Area Show, will talk about his improvisational studio practice, his artistic influences, and his juror's vision for this year's area show. I'm going to put myself on mute and let William talk. Thanks, everyone.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Jessica, for that introduction. And also thank you to everyone for joining, especially to the Kalamazoo Institute of Art, and especially to Catherine Runsbottom, who did an amazing job organizing this year's West Michigan Area Show. Just a few basic things. I know all of you can't respond, but hopefully you can hear me okay. I'm assuming that's a yes. I'm going to start sharing my screen in a second. But just to give you an idea of the lecture I'm going to give today, the first part of the lecture is going to be about my work. And then for the later half, I'm going to very briefly talk about the West Michigan Area Show. And also, this is my first formal time giving a lecture on Zoom in this format. So any patience and grace would probably be appreciated, but I think it'll be fine. So a sense of humor is probably always good too with this stuff. So just because we have a limited amount of time, I'm just gonna get started. And that's my email. All right. So let me just start this. Okay. So I kind of always like to think to myself, like, artist talks are kind of like small deaths that you don't ever come back from. Like, there's like also this idea that like it's very awkward for I think all artists to actually give an artist talk, because you're kind of like, what came into making art because I wanted to be alone in my studio and not talk to anybody, but I have to actually publicly now talk about it in some way. And so a couple of years ago, I was really sincerely thinking about what would be the best way to actually talk about my art that felt genuine. And I think like the artist talk is a form of a performance. I think like there's lots of different ways to do artist talks. But the thing that I really was thinking about a lot about talking about art was there is always this dynamic between the person who is actually making the art and the art itself. And then there's this secondary thing that happens, which is actually when the art leaves the studio and it becomes something else. But I think when artists like talk about their work, and this is something that I've talked about before, regardless of how you feel about your autobiography or where you came from, it is unavoidable in terms of like identifying it as being important in terms of uh, the beginning point of any art practice, but then also as a way to sort of talk about what you have to say in the world. So um, as I began to sort of think about that, I really, hopefully this will start moving. Okay, good. I was really thinking a lot about for myself, like what was like where I came from, what were significant influences in my work that really were like significant in terms of like defining the way that like I really thought about my art practice, and things that were really significant in terms of like, I think really affected me in good or bad ways, but were actually significant in terms of defining how I found myself in the work that I make. So some of you may or may not know, but I was actually raised in rural Ohio outside of Cleveland. This was sort of like a boundary in Cleveland where there were there was like a strong Amish community where I grew up, and it was like very pastoral. In some ways, I think like it was beautiful in some ways, but I think there was a lot of different influences to who I became from where I was from. But one of the things that really I think was significant for me early on was this influence of being outside, playing outside, the influence of nature. And also where I came from, there was like a very strong influence of craft, both in the Amish community, but also within my family. So only recently have I actually started to embrace this history within myself and acknowledging the influence, but there was a really strong form of like quilting history, crocheting history, a history that was really based in where I came from. In Buddhism, they sort of tell the story that you actually choose your parents. And so when I heard that story, it was like really significant for me, because I actually was like, growing up, I was like, I don't belong to these people. I do not know how I was born into this family. I don't have nothing in common with these people. But then when I actually heard there was like the story that you actually choose your family, it really made me rethink like some of the complicated things about what my family history was, and the things that like I struggled with identifying with my family history, but then also too the things that I think that are really important. My parents were like really, I think, had this idyllic vision of returning back to the earth. I think they were kind of like these spiritual hippie kind of 70s parents that were really into talking about their feelings and like sharing things. And I think in some ways that like helped me significantly in terms of identifying and being more aware of myself. But I also think it did present some tensions in terms of some of the family history that I had pushed against, in terms of who I became as a queer person, but then also I do think it was significant in terms of where I come from. The other really big significance of my background is as a child, I was enrolled in a unicycle drill team. This was actually a real, it's not fake. It's like in Newberry, Ohio, and like where most children were enrolled in sports, I was actually a part of this unicycle drill team. We actually traveled the country, and we did performances, and I think this was like actually in terms and influence of my creative direction was really one of like weirdness. Like it was almost like I was raised to be like a circus freak or something. I don't know necessarily about that, but I actually feel like there was this big influence of performance. A block away from where I grew up was this Buckminster Fuller Dome, actually. And as a child, I thought that there was aliens had landed. And I didn't even know who Buckminster Fuller was, which is actually the architect who designed this dome. And you can see there's this photo from the 70s of the unicycle drill team performing in front of the dome. So there was like this very strange sort of like, I think, imprint in me early on as a child, having this influence of this huge structure by where I grew up, which was kind of mysterious and weird and amazing in terms of just like in the form of imagination. Also, something that was really significant for me, I was raised in a working class Irish, Catholic, and Jewish family. My aunt had cerebral palsy, and so very early on, I had this exposure to my aunt and her disabilities, and sort of was very much influenced by that my aunt could not really actually speak very well. She couldn't communicate, but I was very much influenced and affected by the fact that she had a very high sense of intelligence, was able to communicate physically. And so I think this really like had a very strong imprint on me early on in my work in terms of this question of how do you communicate with your physical body? What are alternative ways of using the physical body in that space? When I was living in San Francisco, very early in my 20s, I had the experience of working for Creativity Explored. This was like one of the first art centers for artists with disabilities in the country. I think this experience for me was really influential really early on, because I think it really started me asking questions about why there were certain authorities or languages that were more important than others, especially in the art world. I think in like one level, I think when an artist wants to be a professional, they will attend like a training school. But I was sort of like asking myself questions about like why I was attracted to other artists who worked outside of that canyon, mostly because I think I was really influenced by the directness, the sense of connection to emotional and psychological space. But also there was this sense of freedom in terms of not following the rules. And Vincent Jackson was one of the artists that I actually had the pleasure of working with very early on. And this is actually a portrait that he made of me. There was Harold Fletcher at the time was making zines with a lot of these artists. So he made the zine Fears of Your Life. And I was really like inspired and attracted by this sense of honesty and directness that a lot of these artists actually had in their work. And very early on, also from the influences of my aunt, I really think that I was really questioning why certain power structures were in place, both in terms of being formally trained as an artist versus other types of artists that were outside of that system. I think that there's been a lot of change since I was in my early career about how we consider places that you can come about working in your language with art. But I was really asking myself a lot of questions about the history of certain materials, why certain materials were more valuable than others. And so by the time that I had my first show, museum show at the MCA in Chicago, I had just come out of graduate school. I was really like asking myself a lot of questions about my autobiography, really battling with this like sense of like who I was, what was my voice, how do I define my voice, and where do you actually define or figure out where you fit into history. And so for the first like initial parts of my early work were really one of like working with collage and assemblage. Like I was really like doing a lot of these influences of my Catholicism, but I also was also really asking myself questions about why certain materials were valued more than others in an art canon historical context. In grad school, I really actually couldn't afford to actually buy art materials. So I really started just using materials that were there around me and found. And so from there, I started really defining my practice in terms of making these forms of altars that were altars to different parts of my body and self that I was really trying to understand and figure out. And so early part of my work was really one of really working through these questions of material and time and performance, and also really questioning like how we define whether it's a good work of art or not. These early pieces that I was making, I was actually living in this garage that I still live in to this day. But I started making a lot of work that was found of just like the everyday materials that I had around, just asking myself questions about why we consider certain objects more valuable than others, critiquing the pedestal, but then also really asking questions of like how you actually decide or define when a work of art is finished. Really questioning and asking myself like, what is the endpoint of when we actually consider something finished? In undergraduate, I was like trained as a ceramicist. I think now there's a lot of like open conversation about how we consider the problems of different history and work. I was really thinking to myself and really trying to understand how to define an identity for myself as a queer maker when I was really attracted to the physicality of making and material, but also trying to figure out where I fit into that history. So the first like initial pieces that I had really started making were really ones where I was really thinking about my physical body, asking questions about how the studio could exist, and also this transition between the private and public space. So this first table that I really presented was one contending with this tension of a history of both how does work exist within a private studio when it leaves the studio, how does that change in terms of audience? And so this first piece that I really made was like these assemblages of ceramics, found materials, thrift store items. And there was like an embedding of the weight of my physical body in this piece in terms of asking questions about like how we present works of art, how we consider this balance of materials, and asking questions about material history in class. And so there was this questioning of painting and drawing and sculpture. I was initially really attracted to ceramics because it really offered this almost a bridge between these materials. Ceramics was accessible, it was cheap. And so a lot of the work that I made really early on was one of really just being attracted to materials that were around in my production, and also continually asking this question about how we define and consider what a good work of art is. For me, I really thought of this as like a performance. When I was younger, I really thought I wanted to be a dancer or a gymnast. So a lot of the work that I was making was really one of a private performance where the studio was really asking questions about time and material, but also what was this history of my body and my voice and gesture. And so by the time that I had my show at the Renaissance Society, I was really considering and asking myself questions about the value of art, how we consider a work of art valuable, what do we actually consider in terms of when we're looking at a work of art, how do we think about in terms of like when a viewer approaches a work of art, how we think about material history in terms of why we consider other works of art that are made of more expensive materials more valuable or suited. And then also too, really just thinking about the fact of who actually has accessibility to make art, who is actually able to make art and find accessibility, and how we value that. And so when I had this show at the Renaissance Society, it was, I think, you know, the time, well, it's actually, we're in a really difficult time now, but the time was similar in terms of there was a general sense of malaise. There wasn't really a lot of inspiration about really like the state of the world. And so I really started thinking about this idea of the studio being the place that you can create the world that you wanted to see, and using the studio as a vehicle to serve as a model for the world that I wanted to see that I did not see outside of the studio. And so very early on, in terms of how I was transitioning this questioning of both art, object, and material, the Renaissance, I was really thinking to myself and thinking about where identity fit into minimalism in a queer history. Asking myself questions about how I saw myself fitting into that history, where identity fit in. This is actually Judy Chicago's table. Some of you have probably seen this already. Judy Chicago has had such a renaissance recently, but when I was really early on in my career, there were really no artists who worked in ceramics who were queer. I mean, there was really this lacking in terms of a history of finding people that I could identify with. And this was one of these really early pieces that I came across that I was really inspired about in terms of like this question of identity and material. And so the Renaissance Society table was really one, more than necessarily the objects on this piece, was really a conversation about how we interact and work and work with art as a viewer. And although like a part of me was really questioning endpoint and material and archetypes of what sculpture was, for me, a big part of this piece was really one of the way that artists and the community would move around the table, almost really thinking about how does living collage exist and work. And that actually, like, for me, a big part of this was that this was a form of like a living collage. We're really thinking about drawing and how do you draw with different types of materials? How do you paint with different types of materials? Really thinking about it as assemblage and collage. And so the second iteration of this table at the Nerman Museum was really an X, where I was really pushing these ideas of like these tropes of sculptures, different ways of working. You can see like there's the traditional vessel, there's minimalism present, but really asking questions about labor, how we look at different works of art, how we think about the value of objects, how those all can sort of like come in together to be present in terms of asking questions about where does art exist? How does art exist in a formal institution? Where art exists in the community? Where art also can exist in the private studio? So I was really genuinely searching for answers in terms of where I fit into all of those questions. I feel this pressure in this lecture to be like talking a million miles a minute, which is fine. But the good thing is I have a lot of images. So if you don't hear anything I'm saying, at least you can see a lot of stuff. So early on in my undergraduate career, I actually thought I was going to be a mathematician. I had sort of come to college with this like idea that I wanted to do math. And so I had this like upbringing that was very much expected for me to actually become a mathematician. And I am actually William J. O'Brien VII. I'm the firstborn son in this family. And when I actually came to terms with the fact that I was queer, it really presented a sense of like a spiritual crisis in terms of me really trying to figure out this balance of my very religious upbringing, but then also pairing that with this like sexual side of myself that was not accepted, that was not embraced, that really formed a lot of a tremendous amount of pain in terms of my adulthood, in terms of becoming an artist. There was a lot of pain for me around this sense of who I was raised and expected to be, and then actually who I was. And so a big part of my work has really been about making friends with both of these sides of myself, the side that is actually very spiritual, but then is also very sexual. And so in my 20s, when I came out of the closet, you could say I sort of had like one of several spiritual crises in my life. I was in a tremendous amount of pain. And from there, I think, was searching for answers in terms of understanding ways to better process and understand taking all of the stuff that I was given in my childhood and in my family history, and actually making that into something that was more productive for me instead of it being unproductive. And so through that transition of coming out of the closet and really searching for an answer from that, I really found this necessity in terms of my meditation and yoga practice. So I'm really just very briefly talking about that here, where this is Trungpa Rinpoche. This is Patabi Joyce, my yoga teacher in lineage. And this is not me doing yoga. But through in my 20s, but it looks pretty cool, doesn't it? My back, actually, it's funny because my back is profoundly hurting today, but that's not me. So in my early 20s, is a searching to really understand this bridge between who I was expected to be and who I was. I really found this other spiritual family that I think really helped me really start to understand and gain confidence in who I really was and embrace that in a positive way. And so in my late 20s and early 30s, I've traveled extensively to India to study with my yoga teacher. In South India, these are actually kolams, where they actually make these daily drawings in Hinduism in the front of houses. And so it was like representing this different history and a different religion that actually for me was like very much related to my abstraction. And I think from there, it's sort of like this bridge of actually the part of me that is very logical with actually very spiritual, that is my work. So I'm just very briefly going to talk about the color pencil drawings I make, because there is like in my work, there is like these two balance of the very sort of rebellious, improvisational side of myself, but then there also is very much a rule follower in me. Like I do, even though I really question and that I really struggle with power dynamics and history, I am very much attracted to following rules. And there is a sense of rule following that actually does exist in my work. And so I think that for me, like my background, I think in searching for an answer between these two places of both logic and illogic and rule following were really for me like a lot of struggle early on, because I made work that was very logical, followed rules, but then I also made a lot of work that broke the rules. And I really felt for a long time that I needed to make it make sense. And I think like one thing I sort of have learned is that sometimes you actually have to invent different personalities in the studio to alleviate from the pressure of who the world thinks you're supposed to be. You're allowed to invent new people, whoever you want. You do not have to be the person society told you were supposed to be. You're allowed to invent different characters for yourself that meet your needs. Okay, so the next part of my talk is essential in terms of just talking about my journey, where in 2012, one could say this was the second spiritual crisis that happened to me, where my studio actually burned to the ground. And I lost like hundreds of works of art in this fire. And it was, I think, one of the third or fourth worst fires in Chicago history. They don't really know how the fire happened, but there was a significant sense of loss that was occurred in this event for me that really, I think, shifted the way that I was thinking about and really evaluating how I was operating within my work. Moving forward from the studio fire, I really felt like it really shook everything up inside of me in terms of like asking myself questions about, does art actually have value? Does art actually heal? Is art really beneficial? Because the significance of the amount of work that was lost created so much profound pain that I really had to ask myself serious questions about the whys, and then also figuring out ways to move forward from that. And so after 2012, I was really searching for figuring out how to move forward and also deal with this, asking questions about how we privately grieve and mourn, how we publicly show that. And the shift for me was really one of really fine-tuning myself and in myself, asking myself questions about genuinity, focus, evaluating my intentions in terms of what I was doing. And I did experience a lot of significant trauma in this event. And the first works that I really made were these felt pieces where I really just decided that I was going to cut one thing a day. Because my hands were shaking and I was like having a lot of struggle to really figure out how to work. And I was really thinking about how we privately and publicly mourn. And I was like considering the profound history of quilting, but then also thinking about the AIDS quilts and how in some ways the AIDS quilts were really the biggest minimalist work of art in history, I think, in terms of this way of collective grieving, but then also how we privately and collectively grieve. And so during that time, I was making lists and sort of forming like a language of like how to move forward. And when I came to my first show at Marion Boesky Gallery in 2012, it really was asking myself a lot of questions about how we publicly and privately grieve. And in the back part of the room, first part of the room was a collection of work that actually survived my fire. In the rear of the work room was actually these newer pieces that really that started this transition about asking questions about how we privately and publicly mourn. So the front was really like this side of myself that was there, the old self, but then also there was this new needed acknowledgement of that transition of grieving. And then I was asked to do my first career retrospective a year later after my fire. So there was this bizarre kind of like amazing thing that happened where I was doing my first solo show at the MCA, but it was almost like just contending with this profound sense of grief. And the show was divided into 5 rooms, and each room was like based on a poem I had written, but the last room was like supposed to be new work. And so from there, I really started to think about creating these monuments to loss and to neurosis and to pain, and to the things that actually are not shown publicly. And so that really segued into this new body of work that I was doing that was about this relationship of the body, really looking at funerary deities, how we represent the physical body in statuary, which led into this body of work that really was about grieving and how we privately and publicly grieve. I'm trying to be very mindful of time, so I usually start off my lecture like very strong, and I'm like, go, 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 go. And then actually, I just want to make sure I have time to talk about the West Michigan area show. So this is like a show that I was working in bronze. After that show, I was really thinking about private and public space. This is the show Reliquary that was at Shane Campbell, where I was really evaluating what are the architectural structures of where art was, how we interact with art. And initially I was really thinking about how do we create safe space. So this first installation I did was really one of creating spaces inside spaces to contain the objects I was making in the studio. I made a second installation in Atlanta that was pushing off of these themes of loss, where the structures really are about creating sanctuaries for the viewer to be in. Very briefly, just going to show some new things that I've been working on through the pandemic. Really just been using a lot of materials I have around. I'm always really attracted to doing that. So I've been making a lot of these quilts and collages, and actually these newer mask pieces, also working on ceramics as well. So that's really a relief because we're done talking about my work. So I can talk about the West Michigan area show, which is so much funner for me because it's not about me. So this year I was actually very honored to be asked to be a juror for the 2020 West Michigan area show. This is the first time that I was actually asked ever to do this. And it was really an honor to be asked. It was also very humbling to work through all this amazing art actually and choose and really think about questions that I've sort of alluded to in my practice that I extended into this show, but really asking questions about what is a good work of art? How do we really define a good work of art? And the way that I approached working through the show is initially, as most of you may or may not know, there's around 500 entries for the show. Approximately 100 participants are chosen. The most amazing thing really for me about just seeing all this work was it was really inspiring actually to just actually see that there are so many talented, amazing artists that exist in this area. And it was kind of interesting because I think the show like really came together in terms of like collectively there was a lot of I felt like a real sense of like a genuine reflection of how the world is. Like the world and the time we are in is very turbulent. It's very binary. potentially dark. There's a lot of like strong emotions. But even in through that darkness, I feel like there is a tremendous amount of community and light. And the work that sort of came forward for this show was really, I mean, I took a long time looking through all of the work. And I really was thinking about lots of different things in this process. Like I've been on both sides. Just to see the other side of this process, like being rejected from things and really genuinely thinking about all the artists and advocating for artists. But the more so I was really like, when I was thinking about the West Michigan area show, I was really thinking about this question of genuinity. And one would say that an artist who is successful as what they're doing is very genuine in their approach to how they are working in their work. So that is very, I think, subjective, because there's lots of different ways actually to make a work of art and to be working. But I really was like asking myself questions about how do you see the artist in the work? Whether that is conceptual or process based. I actually felt like I was actually advocating for all sorts of artists in the show. You know, historically speaking, one could say that if you are classically trained, that has more value than if you are self-taught. For me, I think being on the other side of actually being rejected by things and actually being questioned most of my life about my work, I really came into thinking about this show about really asking myself, almost like a poem. One would say that a good drawing actually tells a good story. And similarly to good poems and good works of art, they exhibit and they force the viewer to ask questions. And that reaction was something that I really thought about a lot when I was thinking about this show. What was the story that the works were telling? What was the residue of the artist? But also, too, there was a lot of psychological emotion in the work that was shown for the show, which I thought was really interesting, because I think that in some ways, the one thing I really noticed about the show, which just sort of came out, is there was this both absence of the body in the work in a very literal sense. So you could sort of say, like, in some of the compositions, there is an absence of the figure, where, not to say that this is a reflection of the psychology of the time we're in, but that also that there was this questioning of what is it, or also curiosity. But also, too, there was a genuine sense of psychological and emotional imprint that a lot of these artists really showed in the work. And the pieces that I kept really coming back to were really exhibiting, in a very literal or figurative way, this peculiarity about asking questions about how do we tell a story, how do we reflect the community and world that are around us, how do we accurately be ourselves in the way that we're making work. And also, for me, I'm also really attracted to peculiarity. I'm also attracted to, well, I have a craft background. So going into the show, I really was an advocate for making sure that sculpture and craft-based artists were adequately represented. Because there is this question, I think, a lot with how anyone is trained as an artist. What is the right or wrong way to do things? As somebody who's been outside of that questioning, I think going into the show, I really genuinely asked myself over and over again, what were the works that were really standing out in terms of portraying a sense of reaction, but also demonstrating the artist's body in the work, where you could actually see a sense of the artist's essence in the works that were displayed, where you actually had I don't know, I felt like I got to see the show in person because it's interesting as a juror where I don't actually know anyone's names. I read everyone's statements, but it was really wonderful actually to go and see the show in person because I think that it really showed the breadth and range of technique and skill and also technical prowess, but also how scale really influences how you interact with a work of art. Because like I'm giving this lecture on a computer now, and we're seeing all these slides actually how I saw them on the computer. But for most of you, I'm sure you've seen the show, but I think that for me, I think there was the beginning of the show where it was before the pandemic and I was really anticipating coming, seeing the work in person. And there was actually this question where I didn't actually know if I was going to actually be able to see the show or if there was going to be a show. So that was really amazing in terms of Catherine Ronsbottom and the museum organizing the show. But for me, in the summer, when I actually was able to go and see the works in the show, it was probably the most inspiring thing that happened to me over the summer. Because even this morning, before I gave this talk, I was really struggling against the Zoom, you know, and that I really feel like for all of us, art represents a sense of intimacy. It represents a sense of community. And I feel that I'm really lucky that I was involved in this process to see both sides. But truly, I really felt like the most difficult part of during the show was actually that there was so much good work. And there was such an amazing breadth of technical skill and talent. And also too, like I'm always an advocate of the fringers, like the people who are sort of working outside. And that was really inspiring for me because it reminded me of where I grew up in Ohio a little bit, but also pairing that with where I am now. So it is 11:42. I went through a lot of stuff, but I really tried to time it. This is the first time I've actually had to do a talk where I had to talk about my work and then talk about all this other stuff. So I appreciate your patience. I hope that it was at least visually interesting to look at. But I am also available now to answer any questions that anyone would have about the show or my work process. And I do have the Zoom open chat now, and I didn't know, Jessica, if you wanted to do it that way or we should.
I'll just say, hi everyone, this is Jessica Sundstrom from the KIA. If you are on video and you want to like wave, you can unmute yourself, or if you need help unmuting yourself, waving would be great. If you want to chat into the chat box, if you have a question, that works as well. I see maybe
Oh, this
JC.
is very, very interesting to hear how you've created and everything that you've gone through. It was quite a revelation, and I have often wondered, the fire, that just kind of broke my heart to lose all of that work that you put so hard, your heart and soul into.
Mm-hmm.
It's amazing to, I can't think of how I want to put it, to see what you have done and then to come back from that crisis the way you have. I also would like to apologize for my moving around so much during the first part of it. I have an 18-month-old Havanese puppy that Frank has gone on errands and I was left with her, and I finally took her out and put her in her kennel, so she's not too happy with me right now. But thank you very much for taking your time to do this, and I'll let somebody else talk.
Thank you for saying that. I mean, I think like for me, I think like with the fire, question of the fire, there are certain things that sort of came about to prepare me for that. I also think everyone wants to hear like a triumph story when something bad happens. And the one thing that I've sort of learned through that experience is sometimes things are just bad and nothing good comes out of it except the ability to be more empathetic towards people genuinely. So for me, I really felt after that period, it was like kind of like no more bullshit, just make art and help people. And I think it clarified that for me, because there's a lot, I think, of disingenuousness involved with the creative field. Artists have a tendency to struggle with that all the time. I talk about it all the time where I'll be like, oh, I just went to an art opening. Why do I feel so depressed afterwards? No, but it's just like, there's a sense of like, why is that, right? And I think it's just like, I'm trying to advocate more for genuinity, even if it's awkward. So thank you for saying that.
I think we all go through that disappointment of being rejected and
Yes.
not understanding the reason why. So when I get accepted into an art show, I get all excited. If I don't win anything, that's fine. But I'm so excited to have someone accept my art. And
Yeah.
I appreciate that I got accepted into this show this year. Thank you.
Of course. Congratulations. Let's see here. Yeah, of course. I mean, the question was, your work and your story as a queer person in the Midwest really resonated with me. I was astonished how much it paralleled my own experience. Do you find yourself struggling to reconcile with being a queer person with a small town Midwestern upbringing? And do you find this is reflected in your recent work? I think that, yes, we're in a very polarizing time. I said to myself very early on in my career, I was never going to talk about my family history publicly and the problems of my family history. But I also feel that that's why I was sort of alluding to the fact that even though there was a lot, I think, of difficulty in my family history about maybe understanding who I was, there is a lot of value there to lineage, even if there's a lot of pain there. Now I really feel like I'm trying to just serve as an advocate, but also to not be afraid, to be confident, because I think confidence is related to that. When the world is trying to tell you that you're not a good person, it does subconsciously affect you, even though you might intellectually not believe it. So part of my chapter now really is to advocate for that confidence and value as much as I can. And also to, I firmly believe in the power of art. I really do. Sometimes people will feel like, what's the point of making art right now? But I do feel that there's a lot of power and value in transforming it, no matter where you are. Even if it seems like the outside conditions are not optimal. And the one thing that I've been talking a lot about with my students is actually, even if the outside conditions are constantly changing, it is good to always think about what is the continuous thread that is connecting you and your work, no matter what those conditions look like. So really always touching base with that all the time. Like just reminding yourself of that. Because that, and also too, I think that's only really coming from a place where I've had many different experiences where I remember my first mentor in undergrad frequently pulled me aside and told me to stop making art. Like I've had like a lot of different experiences with that. Okay, enough about me. Power of art to whom, in what ways? I think like in both ways from that. I think like the power of art being that I think art has the ability, for me, I think one thing that really came out of my fire was, I think there is like this idea of the maker of the work and the objects, but I think that the power of art is the movement in between those two spaces, right? It's the ability to actually move through something is what I really think that is about. Whether something's actually made or not is a whole different thing, but I think that's for me where I think about that. How do you negotiate your own studio practice with the major trends occurring in the contemporary art world? Do you feel pressure to make decisions in a certain way in order to maintain an exhibition record or stay fashionable? Yeah, of course. I mean, that was something recently that came out of the pandemic, where after my studio fire, I really felt like should I screen who's on this call to see if before I talk about someone? I really felt that there was like this issue with, I had to sort of realize that there were people in my life who were taking advantage of my trauma, that they knew by telling me that the work was not good, I would work harder. Instead of saying the work was good, they would say, oh, the work's okay, I think you could do a better job, knowing that I would work more for them to make them more money. And in the same way, I felt like there was an issue with that in terms of just really coming to terms with the fact that obviously people like the work I make that's pretty. I mean, I don't really like making that work all the time, but that is the reality, right? Like beauty has like standards, right? So if someone, obviously the color pencil drawings I make have a different relationship to the viewer than the assemblage work, right? But money is a funny thing. I think only recently have I, over the past, I'd say 5 years after I came out of my studio fire, that I actually was kind of like, okay, who am I really working for here? And that question is very challenging for any artist, I think. But in the long run, the shows that I have done that I have the most regrets about are the ones where I listen too much to other people and not myself. I can say that firmly. So,
Hi.
Yes.
Hi. I have a question. My name's Jason. It's nice to meet you. You referred to how you found the artist's essence. How did you come to? What process did you use to understand the artist's essence, as you say?
I think one way to do that would be about ritual. I think that there's always like this beginning point of discipline that I think every artist needs to do in order to form a sense of confidence in what they do. I think magic actually happens when there is a merging of being physically present with something and also allowing a sense of improvisation and surprise. So just as there is the need, I think, for all artists to be physically disciplined, there's also the necessity to actually be improvisational and experimentation. I think artists usually, not all of them, fall into two categories, where there's artists who are really good at following the rules and artists who are like not good rule following artists. Not that that matters at all, but then a question to ask would be, if you're finding yourself stuck in the process of what you're making, are you following your rules too closely and need to allow yourself to experiment more space? If you're feeling very confused and all over the place, you might actually need to apply rules. So essence, I think also too, is an imprint of the emotional quality of the artist through ritual.
So how did you come to understand the ritual practices of the show's participants in your judgment of the pieces? Or did you do more research somehow? You said that seeing the artist's essence was a fundamental concept in your judgment. Did I misunderstand that?
Yes. It's kind of like this, like when I was early on in my career, I was really paranoid and I didn't let anyone in the studio. Because I was kind of like, no one can be around when I'm making work because it'll mess up the magic or something. And I think that kind of relates to that, where, but also too, I think what you're also referring to, I think, has to do with community. And there can be energy present in community that's above the individual. I don't think good works of art are made by the artist's ego. I think they're made by something bigger. But I just want to make sure, Scott Peterson, did you have a question you wanted to ask?
Yeah, I do. I have a question about, you said you had a mathematical side in your brain, and I'm not an artist, but I do some writing. I write, And I think that the mathematical side of my brain was basically stamped out shortly after birth. And I've always been dealing with that. And I was wondering, I see how the mathematical side works in your colored pencils drawing, which are very beautiful, very geometric and soothing. But I feel like I'm basically, I'm riding around in a vehicle that's missing one wheel. And I have a hard time reconciling that geometric, that mathematical side. Tell me about how that works with you.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think like music is a part of that. I think like when I look at the work, color is more like sound. It's like a taste. And so one thing to consider with the things you're talking about with accessing that part of yourself would be to reconsider the possibility of being able to touch and smell and hear that side of your brain. Because usually you're programmed to go one way, but also for me, when I think about the making of that work, it is really about sounds. So it is really about a tonal thing, similar to music. So even like when you read or write something, that speech tonal language is there too. I usually like to say I make really organized work when I feel really like bad. So when I make that work, it's usually because I need to feel safe. And when I'm feeling better is when I'm more relaxed with the other work. But I think that if I'm understanding your question, for me, that's really about, there's a visual rule following, but it is actually more about sound and how colors sound and nature and sounds of like nature as well. Mm-hmm. I don't even know if that made any sense.
Oh, yeah. I'm a very descriptive writer, and I write through not through my eyes, I write through my five senses, and so I'm good in that. So I understand it. That's very, and I love music too, to listen to music while I write. I'm more with channeling that and putting it into a form that I guess my real dream is, I write a lot of poetry and publish a lot of poetry, but as well as essays, but I want to write a sonnet, and I've never been able to train my brain to do that, or any kind of pattern poetry. So, but what I hear from you is just follow it, just go with that feeling of the senses and what you hear and what you see.
Yeah, I think that's what my initial thought about that would be approaching it differently. You're not my student, so I'm not going to tell you what to do. But I would say approaching it differently than you would normally do that, so you don't have the same pattern there to be surprised.
Right.
And I'm sorry, Martin, did you have a question or no?
Well, I guess jurying a show is an interesting process. I'm kind of interested in your thoughts about the act of jurying. And I wonder if you say a few more words about why or how you juried this show in Kalamazoo. This show doesn't seem to have a particular look, so it doesn't seem that you're searching for a kind of look for the show. Mm-hmm. So how did you, what are your thoughts?
I mean, I think that for me, I was thinking about genuinely looking at all of the work and evaluating which works stood out the most without, one, my personal preferences first, two, why did I keep returning to these pieces over and over again and asking myself questions about that. I think that there was also too, is like, I would say the vision of the show for me was more of like showing a mirror of the area. an accurate representation of what was submitted. And then also advocating more for craft-based artists and sculpture. I would say that was probably what I was doing, if, you know, so in terms of like thinking about it. And also peculiarity and weirdness were themes that I was really responding to. Work that actually was very provocative and weird. More of an advocating for that. I was also like trying to advocate for genuinity and emotional work that was genuinely showing stories of emotion to the viewer. But it was difficult, I will say. It was probably one of the hardest things I've had to do. So, because I'm an artist. It's like basically, it's probably if you're not an artist, I mean, I was thinking about everyone, all sides of it. It was very difficult to narrow it down, so.
I'm sorry, everyone. This is Jessica Sundstrom from the KIA again. I know that there are lots of questions, and this was really great. But because this is on a Zoom format, we will have to end right about now. But thank you so much to Bill for joining us today. And thank you also so much to all of you for joining us and bringing your questions and your passion and your enthusiasm. To all of you who are here in this Zoom who are in the show, congratulations. And also, we will have some West Michigan Area Show artists speak at the September 29th ArtBreak. So if you are interested in this one, be sure to join us for that one as well. And if you haven't yet had an opportunity to see the show, the KIA is open on Fridays and Saturdays. You do need to get time ticketing on our website. And yeah, we will have a September 15th ArtBreak as well with the Kirk Newman Art School residents. Their show is going up as well. So if you come to the KIA, you will be able to see that. And also a big thank you to Catherine Ransbottom, the curator of the show. It's amazing. And again, to Bill O'Brien for the amazing juring process and this really, really fascinating, interesting talk about the process. Any last closing words, Bill?
No, congratulations to everybody. It's a really wonderful show. So you should feel good about your work and it looks great.
All right, thank you so much. Thank you to everyone for joining us. And I'm sorry if your question didn't get answered, but we do have to end the talk now. But I hope you all have a great rest of your day. And I am going to end the meeting for us all. Bye.